A chain of injustice. The small southern town of Bellwood was basking in the glow of a bright spring afternoon. The sun cast its warm rays across the tidy streets, lined with oak trees, small businesses, and bustling outdoor cafes. Mary Anderson, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, was on her way to the local jewelry repair shop. A woman of poise and quiet strength, Mary was known for her wisdom and grace. Her polished demeanor came naturally, as did her love for her small community despite its underlying tensions. Today, Mary wore her favorite pearl gray dress and a matching wide-brimmed hat adorned with subtle silk flowers. Around her neck hung a simple gold chain with a small locket, a gift from her late husband, Samuel, who had passed away 5 years earlier. The locket held a tiny photograph of their wedding day, a memory Mary treasured more than words could express. That chain, much like her love for Samuel, was irreplaceable. As she approached Greenleaf Jewelers, Mary's mind wandered to her plans for the day. After dropping off the necklace for repair, she planned to pick up fresh flowers from the market and spend the afternoon tending to her small garden. The thought of lilacs and sunflowers swaying in the breeze brought a smile to her face. But her peaceful afternoon was about to be shattered. The encounter. The tinkling sound of the shop's bell announced Mary's arrival. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and velvet-lined jewelry cases. Mr. Greenleaf, the elderly owner of the store, greeted her warmly. "Good afternoon, Mary. Here to fix that chain of yours." Mary returned his smile. "Yes, Mr. Greenleaf. It's been acting up again. I'd hate to lose this locket." "Don't worry," he said, taking the necklace gently from her hands. "I'll have it good as new by the end of the week." Mary thanked him and turned to leave. Just as she stepped outside, a voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the warm air. "Excuse me, ma'am." Mary paused mid-step and turned to see a uniformed police officer approaching her. He was young, no more than 30, with a clean-shaven face that seemed almost too severe for his age. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, but there was an edge to his demeanor that immediately set Mary on guard. "Yes, officer," she asked politely, though her pulse quickened. The officer stopped a few feet away, his posture rigid. "What's in the bag?" he asked, gesturing to her modest leather purse, worn but well kept. Mary blinked, unsure how to respond. "I beg your pardon." "The bag," he repeated, his tone sharper now. "Looks like you've got something valuable in there. Mind if I take a look?" The absurdity of the situation struck her, but Mary held her composure. "This bag, it's just my personal belongings. I don't believe I've done anything to warrant a search, officer." The officer's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. "I've seen a lot of people carrying things they shouldn't. Why don't you save us both some trouble and let me check?" Mary's grip on her purse tightened. "Officer, unless you have reason to suspect I've committed a crime, I'll be continuing with my day." A few passers-by slowed their steps, curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Whispers began to ripple through the small crowd gathering nearby. Mary felt a flush of embarrassment, but held her ground. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the officer said, his hand hovering near his belt. "Hand it over." "No," Mary said firmly. "I know my rights." A line crossed. The officer's jaw tightened, and before Mary could react, he snatched the bag from her grasp. Gasps echoed from the onlookers as Mary reached out instinctively, her voice rising. "You have no right." Ignoring her protest, the officer opened the bag and rifled through its contents. Mary watched in disbelief as he pulled out her wallet, a small book of poetry, and a handkerchief embroidered with her initials. Her privacy was being violated, and her dignity stripped away in broad daylight. "What exactly are you looking for?" she demanded, her voice trembling with controlled anger. The officer shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. "Just making sure there's nothing you shouldn't have." Mary's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "This is harassment," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the growing crowd. "I will not stand for this." The officer laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Go ahead and report me. Until then, I'll be keeping this. With that, he tucked the purse under his arm and turned as if the matter were closed. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but no one stepped forward. Mary stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had faced prejudice before, but this blatant abuse of power was a new low. The arrival. Just as the officer began walking toward his patrol car, the low hum of an approaching vehicle caught everyone's attention. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows glinting in the sunlight. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a tall man in his late 30s, dressed in a sharp suit that screamed authority. He moved with purpose, his piercing gaze locking onto the scene before him. The crowd parted as he approached, his presence commanding respect. As he drew closer, the officer's smug expression faltered. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his tone calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. The officer's hand twitched nervously. "Just doing my job, sir." The man's eyes narrowed as he looked from the officer to Mary. "And your job involves taking a woman's personal belongings without cause." She was acting suspicious, the officer stammered, his confidence wavering. "I was just..." "Enough," the man interrupted. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a badge, flashing it for all to see. "Special Agent Michael Harris, FBI. And that woman happens to be my godmother." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. Mary's eyes widened as she recognized the man. Michael had been a close friend of her late son, Jacob. Though their paths had diverged over the years, she remembered him as a bright and determined young man. "Michael?" she said softly, relief washing over her. He turned to her, his expression softening. "Aunt Mary, are you all right?" She nodded, though her composure was beginning to crack. "I'm fine now." Michael's jaw tightened as he turned back to the officer. "You're done here. Hand over the bag." The officer hesitated, his face pale. "I was just..." "Now," Michael said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, the officer handed the bag to Michael, who immediately returned it to Mary. "I'm sorry this happened," he said, his voice low. "I'll make sure he's held accountable." The aftermath. As the crowd began to disperse, whispers of the incident rippling through the small town, Mary took a steadying breath. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Let me take you home," he offered. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Michael." As they walked to his car, Mary couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. Though the day had begun with injustice, it had also revealed the power of standing firm and the strength found in unexpected allies. But deep down, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Shadows of justice. The drive back to Mary Anderson's modest home was a quiet one. Michael Harris, seated in the driver's seat of his sleek black sedan, kept glancing at his godmother through the rearview mirror. Mary, still clutching her vintage purse like a lifeline, stared silently out the window. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across Bellwood's streets. The cheerful small-town charm felt tainted by the earlier confrontation. "Aunt Mary," Michael said gently, breaking the silence. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." Mary turned to look at him, her lips forming a weary but forgiving smile. "It wasn't your fault, Michael. You couldn't have known." He tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "But I should have. That officer, his behavior was inexcusable. And this isn't the first time I've heard complaints about him." "What do you mean?" Mary asked, her interest piqued. Michael hesitated, his jaw working as he tried to decide how much to say. "Officer Daniels has a record. Harassment complaints, excessive force allegations, but nothing ever sticks. His superiors sweep it under the rug every time." Mary's brow furrowed. "How is that possible?" Michael sighed. "Small towns can be their own little worlds. Corruption runs deep, and people protect their own. It's going to take more than a stern talking to bring him down." Mary nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll do what's necessary." This isn't just about me, Michael. If he's done this to others, it needs to stop. Michael glanced at her, admiration shining in his eyes. Even after everything, Mary's resolve was unshaken. You're right, and I think I know where to start. The plan. The next morning, Michael stood in the living room of Mary's home, a cozy space filled with family photos and memories of a life well lived. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air as Mary placed 2 steaming mugs on the coffee table. Michael had already set up his laptop, pulling up records and files he'd accessed through his FBI connections. This is Officer Daniels' record, Michael began, gesturing to the screen. Multiple complaints, like I said. But the reports are vague, and there's always a lack of evidence. It's almost like someone's scrubbing the files. Mary leaned over, her eyes scanning the screen. How do we find evidence that hasn't been erased? Mary's gaze fell on a photo of her late husband, Samuel, on the mantel. He had always believed in standing up for what was right, no matter how difficult. She straightened her back. Let's start with the people in this town. I've lived here all my life, Michael. If someone has a story, I'll know how to find them. Michael nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. All right, but we have to be careful. If Daniels or his allies catch wind of this, they'll do everything they can to stop us. Digging deep. Mary and Michael's first stop was the local diner, a staple in Bellwood where gossip traveled faster than the speed of light. As they walked through the door, the warm scent of pancakes and bacon greeted them. Conversations hushed momentarily as patrons noticed Mary's arrival. Her confrontation with Officer Daniels had become the talk of the town. "Morning, Mary," called Betty, the diner's waitress, and an old friend of Mary's. Her voice was warm, but her eyes betrayed concern. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you all right?" Mary smiled gently. "I'm fine, Betty. But I'm looking for information." Betty's brows knitted together. "What kind of information?" Michael stepped forward, his presence as commanding as ever. "We're looking into Officer Daniels. Have you heard of anyone else who's had trouble with him?" Betty's lips pressed into a thin line, and she glanced around the diner nervously. "I've heard things, but people are scared to talk. Daniels has a lot of friends in the department. They won't need to be scared if we can get enough evidence to expose him," Michael assured her. "Anything you can tell us would help." Betty hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There's a young man named Jerome. Works at the gas station off Main Street. Daniels hassled him pretty bad a few months back. Took his paycheck, said it was evidence in some bogus investigation. Jerome hasn't been the same since." Michael nodded. "Thank you, Betty. We'll talk to him." As they left the diner, Mary glanced at Michael. "Do you think Jerome will talk to us?" Michael's expression was grim. "We'll find out." A frightened witness. Jerome, a lanky young man barely out of his teens, was stocking shelves when Mary and Michael arrived at the gas station. His eyes darted nervously as they approached, and he visibly tensed when Michael introduced himself. "I don't want no trouble," Jerome said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Daniels, he'll make my life hell if I say anything." "We're not here to cause trouble," Mary said gently, stepping forward. Her calming presence seemed to ease Jerome's fear. "We just want to hear your story. You're not alone in this." Jerome hesitated, glancing around as if expecting Daniels to appear at any moment. Finally, he spoke. "He came in here one night, said I was stealing from the register. It wasn't true, but he didn't care. Took my paycheck and threatened to arrest me if I said anything." Michael's jaw tightened. "Did he file any kind of report?" Jerome shook his head. "No, just took the money and left. My boss wouldn't stand up to him either. Said it wasn't worth the risk." "Do you still have your pay stubs or any proof he took your money?" Michael asked. Jerome nodded slowly. "Yeah. I kept everything. Didn't know if I'd ever need it, but I can get it for you." Michael placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder. "That would help a lot, Jerome. Thank you." The warning. As Mary and Michael left the gas station, a chill ran down Mary's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. Michael seemed to sense it too, his eyes scanning the street as they walked to the car. Just as they reached the vehicle, a patrol car turned the corner and slowed as it passed them. Behind the wheel was Officer Daniels, his cold gaze locking onto Michael. He smirked, as if to say, "I'm watching." The web of corruption. The patrol car's ominous crawl past Mary and Michael sent a shiver down her spine. Officer Daniels' smirk was a warning, loud and clear. They were playing a dangerous game. Michael placed a steadying hand on Mary's shoulder as they climbed into the sit-in. He watched Daniels' car disappear around the corner before speaking. "He knows we're digging," Michael said grimly. "But that just means we're getting closer to something he doesn't want uncovered." Mary's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her purse on her lap. "Michael, if he's willing to intimidate people in broad daylight, who knows what else he's capable of?" Michael's jaw clenched. "We'll be careful, but we can't stop now. Not when we're this close to exposing him." The search for allies. The next morning, Michael reviewed the files Jerome had provided. The young man had been meticulous, keeping every pay stub, and even jotting down the date and time Officer Daniels had taken his paycheck. Michael leaned back in his chair, flipping through the evidence. It wasn't enough to bring Daniels down yet, but it was a start. Mary entered the living room with a tray of tea. She had spent the morning calling friends and acquaintances, people she trusted to provide leads on others who might have faced Daniels' wrath. "I spoke to Alice from my church," Mary said, setting the tray down. "Her nephew, Darnell, had a run-in with Daniels last year. Something about a traffic stop that escalated for no reason. She's going to ask him if he's willing to talk to us." Michael nodded. "Good. The more voices we have, the harder it will be for them to silence us." Mary poured herself a cup of tea, her expression pensive. "Do you think Daniels is acting alone, or is this part of something bigger?" Michael's eyes darkened. "In my experience, corruption like this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Someone's protecting him." A frightened community. Mary and Michael spent the rest of the day reaching out to potential witnesses. They visited a retired teacher who claimed Daniels had harassed her for interfering in a school dispute. They spoke to a shop owner who had seen Daniels rough up a teenager outside his store. Each person had a story, but most were reluctant to come forward. "He'll make my life hell," the shop owner said, shaking his head. "I've got a family to think about." Michael's frustration grew with each encounter. "Fear is how people like Daniels stay in power," he muttered as they walked back to the car. "They've created a culture of silence." Mary placed a hand on his arm. "Then we need to show them it's safe to speak. We need to be the ones to break that silence." A hidden trail. Late that evening, Michael sat at the dining table, poring over the files he had accessed through his FBI clearance. His laptop screen glowed in the dim light as he dug deeper into Daniels' records. Most of the official complaints against him were suspiciously vague, with no follow-up investigations. It was as if someone had deliberately buried the evidence. Mary entered the room quietly, carrying a plate of sandwiches. "You've been at this all day, Michael. You need to eat." Michael looked up, offering her a tired smile. "Thanks, Aunt Mary. I'm starting to think you're right about this being bigger than just Daniels. There are too many gaps in his record. Someone's been cleaning up after him." Mary sat across from him, her brow furrowed. "Do you think it's his superiors?" Michael nodded. "Possibly. Or someone higher up who has something to gain by keeping him in place. Either way, we need more than just witness statements. We need hard evidence." He pulled up a new file, one marked Internal Affairs. "If we can find a paper trail, payments, favors, anything that ties Daniels to someone else, we'll have what we need." The late-night visitor. As the clock struck midnight, the quiet hum of the neighborhood was shattered by the sound of a car pulling up outside Mary's house. Michael's head snapped up, his instincts immediately on high alert. He moved to the window and peered out through the curtains. A patrol car was parked across the street. The shadowy figure of Officer Daniels stood next to it, his gaze fixed on the house. Michael's blood boiled as he realized Daniels was there to intimidate them. "Stay here," Michael said firmly, grabbing his jacket and stepping outside. The cool night air did little to temper Michael's anger as he approached Daniels. "You lost, officer." Daniels smirked, leaning casually against his car. "Just making my rounds. Thought I'd check in on our local troublemaker." Michael's eyes narrowed. "Harassment is a poor look for a cop, Daniels, especially one with your record." Daniels' smirk faltered for a moment before he straightened up. "Careful, Harris. You're poking your nose where it doesn't belong. Things could get messy." Michael stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You don't scare me, Daniels, and you've underestimated the people in this town. Your time's running out." Daniels glared at him, his fists clenching at his sides. Without another word, he climbed into his car and drove off, his tires screeching as he rounded the corner. Michael returned to the house, his adrenaline still pumping. Mary met him at the door, her face pale but resolute. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Michael said, closing the door behind him. "But Daniels just made a mistake. He showed his hand. Now we know he's scared." Connecting the dots. The next day, Michael received a call from a former colleague at the FBI. "I ran those names you sent me," the agent said. "Daniels and his captain have connections to a private security firm that's been under investigation for corruption. Looks like they've been funneling money through shell companies." Michael's mind raced. "Can you send me everything you have?" "Already done," the agent replied. "But be careful, Harris. These guys play dirty." Michael hung up and turned to Mary, who was sitting nearby. "This is it," he said. "We've found the connection. Daniels isn't just a bad cop. He's part of a larger operation." Mary's eyes widened. "What do we do now?" Michael's expression hardened. "We take this to the media. If the department won't hold him accountable, we'll make sure the public does." The first step toward justice. As they prepared their evidence, Mary couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. For the first time, it felt like they were making progress. But she also knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. Together, she and Michael were determined to shine a light on the corruption that had plagued their town for far too long. The storm breaks. The evening air in Bellwood carried an unusual weight, as though the entire town was holding its breath. Mary Anderson sat in her living room, the flicker of a single lamp casting soft shadows across the walls. The documents and evidence Michael had compiled were spread across the coffee table, each piece of paper another step toward uncovering the truth about Officer Daniels. But Mary couldn't shake the sense of unease that crept into her heart. Michael Harris, her godson, and an FBI agent, was pacing the room. His usually calm demeanor was tinged with frustration and determination. He paused to stare out the window, scanning the darkened street for any sign of movement. "Michael," Mary began softly, "you've been on your feet all day. Sit down, have some tea. You won't do anyone any good if you burn yourself out." Michael turned to her with a faint smile, but his eyes were heavy with worry. "I know, Aunt Mary. But Daniels isn't going to back down easily. The closer we get to the truth, the more desperate he'll become." Mary nodded, her hands clasped around her teacup. "Desperate men make mistakes, and that will be his downfall." A community mobilized. The next morning, Mary and Michael began their most daring step yet, bringing the community into their fight. Armed with the evidence they'd collected, they reached out to trusted friends, neighbors, and local leaders who had long felt the weight of Daniels' corruption, but were too afraid to act. Mary started with her church. Standing at the front of the modest building, she spoke to a group of parishioners who had gathered after Sunday service. "For too long, we've allowed fear to keep us silent," Mary said, her voice steady and resolute. "But now we have a chance to stand together and demand justice. Officer Daniels has preyed on this community for years, but he's not invincible. If we speak with one voice, they can't ignore us." There was a murmur of agreement, but also hesitation. One woman raised her hand. "Mary, what if they come after us? You know how these things go. People who speak out get hurt." Mary's gaze softened. "I understand your fear. Believe me, I do. But that's why we must do this together. They can intimidate one person, but they can't silence all of us." Michael stepped forward, holding up a folder. "We have evidence," he said. "And with your help, we can gather even more. Witness statements, personal accounts, anything that shows the pattern of abuse Daniels has built over the years. The more we have, the stronger our case will be." Slowly, hands began to rise. One by one, people shared their stories of unjust fines, baseless searches, and humiliations suffered at the hands of Daniels. Each voice added to the growing chorus, and by the end of the meeting, Mary and Michael had a list of names and stories to build their case. The break-in. That night, as Mary prepared for bed, a loud crash jolted her from her thoughts. She froze, her heart pounding as the sound of shattering glass echoed through the house. Michael burst into the room, his firearm drawn. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low but firm. Mary nodded, clutching her phone as Michael moved toward the source of the noise. The living room window had been smashed, and the room was eerily quiet save for the faint rustle of curtains blowing in the night breeze. Michael's eyes scanned the room, his training kicking in. He noticed a shadow move outside and darted to the front door, throwing it open just in time to see a figure disappearing into the darkness. He didn't pursue. This was a message, not a robbery. Returning to the living room, he found Mary standing by the couch, her face pale but composed. "It was Daniels, wasn't it?" she asked. Michael nodded. "Or someone working for him. They want us to back off." Mary straightened her shoulders. "Then we know we're on the right track. Let's make sure they regret trying to scare us." A call for help. The next day, Michael contacted a former FBI colleague, Special Agent Lisa Carter. Lisa had a reputation for being relentless, and Michael trusted her implicitly. "Michael, you're playing with fire," Lisa said after he explained the situation. "But if Daniels is connected to something bigger, we can't let this slide. I'll see what I can pull on his department and this security firm you mentioned." "Thanks, Lisa. I owe you one." "You owe me about 20, she quipped. "But who's counting?" With Lisa's help, Michael began piecing together the larger puzzle. The private security firm Daniels was connected to had a history of shady dealings, including ties to local officials who had a vested interest in keeping people like Daniels in power. The web of corruption was vast, but Michael knew they were beginning to unravel it. The protest. As word of Mary and Michael's efforts spread, the community rallied behind them. A protest was organized outside the Bellwood police station, drawing dozens of residents who carried signs demanding accountability and justice. Mary stood at the front, her presence a beacon of strength for those who had long felt powerless. "We will not be silenced," she declared, her voice ringing out across the crowd. "We deserve better. Our children deserve better, and we will not stop until we see change." Inside the station, Daniels watched the scene unfold from a window. His face was a mask of barely contained rage. "This is getting out of hand," he snarled to his captain. "We need to shut this down." The captain, a burly man with a cold demeanor, crossed his arms. "Not yet. Let them make noise. It'll blow over." Daniels wasn't so sure. He could feel the walls closing in, and he knew that if Mary and Michael succeeded, his entire world would come crashing down. A revelation. Back at Mary's house, Michael received an encrypted email from Lisa. The subject line read, "You're going to want to see this." Michael opened the file and scanned the contents. His eyes widened as he realized what he was looking at: a series of bank transfers linking Daniels and his captain to the private security firm. The amounts were staggering, and the dates coincided with several of the incidents they had investigated. "Aunt Mary," Michael said, turning the laptop toward her. "This is it. This is the proof we needed." Mary leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen. Then we're ready to bring this to the world. Michael nodded. Let's make sure everyone knows the truth. The fight for justice. The town of Bellwood buzzed with anticipation and unease. The protest outside the police station had drawn more attention than anyone anticipated. News outlets picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with posts detailing the community's grievances and the alleged corruption in the police department. Mary Anderson and Michael Harris became reluctant symbols of the fight for justice, their faces appearing in local newspapers and online forums. Mary's home, once a quiet sanctuary, now served as the headquarters for their growing movement. Volunteers came and went, carrying boxes of flyers, organizing meetings, and compiling witness statements. The living room table was covered in papers, laptops, and hastily scribbled notes. In the middle of it all, Mary sat with a calm determination, her presence a grounding force for everyone around her. "We're making progress," Michael said as he entered the room, a stack of freshly printed documents in hand. "Lisa's information has been cross-referenced with what we've gathered. It paints a damning picture of Daniels and his captain. They've been siphoning money through that private security firm for years." Mary looked up from the statement she was reviewing. "And the community?" Michael smiled faintly. "They're ready. The protest was just the beginning. People are coming forward with more stories. Daniels isn't just corrupt. He's left a trail of victims who are finally finding their voices." Mary nodded. "Good, but we need to stay vigilant. Daniels won't go down without a fight. A dangerous retaliation." Late that night, as most of the volunteers had gone home, Mary and Michael stayed up reviewing the latest evidence. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of papers and the soft hum of the laptop. Mary's eyes were tired, but she refused to rest. Michael, ever watchful, noticed a shadow move outside the window. He immediately tensed, his hand moving instinctively to his firearm. "Aunt Mary, stay here," he whispered, rising from his chair. Mary's eyes widened. "Michael, what is it?" "I don't know," he said, moving toward the front door. He opened it cautiously, stepping onto the porch. The night was still, the air thick with tension. Then he saw it. A black SUV idling across the street, its headlights off. As soon as Michael's eyes met the vehicle, it sped away, tires screeching. Michael re-entered the house, his expression grim. "They're watching us. Daniels or someone working for him." Mary's face hardened. "Let them watch. They're only proving that we're getting too close to the truth." Michael nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was coming. The whistleblower. The next morning, a man walked into Mary's house with his baseball cap pulled low over his face. He introduced himself as Officer Raymond Grant, a colleague of Daniels who had reached his breaking point. "I've seen too much," Grant said, his voice low but resolute. "Daniels and the captain, they've been running this racket for years, falsifying reports, planting evidence, shaking down anyone they think won't fight back." Michael leaned forward. "Why are you coming forward now?" Grant sighed. "Because it's gone too far. People are getting hurt, lives ruined. And Daniels, he's out of control. The incident with Miss Anderson was the last straw for me. I can't be part of this anymore." Mary placed a hand on Grant's arm. "Thank you for your courage. Your testimony will make a difference." Grant handed Michael a USB drive. "This has everything I've collected. Emails, financial records, internal memos. It's not everything, but it's enough to show a pattern." Michael took the drive, his respect for Grant evident. "You've just given us what we need to bring them down." The turning point. With Grant's evidence, Michael and Mary's team compiled a comprehensive report. They decided to hold a press conference, inviting local and regional media to cover the story. The town square was packed with residents, journalists, and curious onlookers. Mary stood at the podium, her voice steady as she recounted her experience and the broader corruption they had uncovered. "This isn't just about one officer," she said. This is about a system that allowed him to operate with impunity. But we will not be silent. We will not be intimidated. Justice will prevail. Michael followed, presenting the evidence and calling for an independent investigation into the Bellwood Police Department. The crowd erupted in applause, their collective resolve strengthening. Daniels strikes back. The press conference was a success, but it also painted a target on Mary and Michael's backs. That night, as they celebrated with their team, a loud explosion rocked the neighborhood. Everyone rushed outside to find Mary's car engulfed in flames. Michael immediately called the fire department, but his mind raced with suspicion. This was no accident. Daniels is desperate, Michael said, his voice cold. He's trying to scare us off. Mary's face was pale but determined. Then we'll show him that fear won't win. Tomorrow, we take this to the state attorney's office. The legal battle begins. Armed with their evidence, Michael and Mary met with the state attorney the following morning. The attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Angela Perez, listened intently as they presented their case. "This is serious," Perez said, flipping through the files. "If what you're saying is true, this goes beyond Bellwood. We could be looking at a statewide corruption network." Michael nodded. "We need your help to take this further. Daniels and his captain won't stop until they're held accountable." Perez leaned back in her chair. "You've done the hard work. Now it's my turn. I'll open an investigation immediately." As they left the office, Mary turned to Michael. "Do you think this will be enough?" Michael placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's more than enough. We've started a fire they can't put out." A glimmer of hope. Back in Bellwood, the mood was one of cautious optimism. The investigation would take time, but the community's resolve had only grown stronger. Mary and Michael knew the battle wasn't over, but for the first time, they felt they were on the brink of real change. As Mary stood on her porch that evening, watching the sun set over the town she had called home her entire life, she felt a deep sense of pride. They had faced fear, intimidation, and danger, but they had not wavered. Justice was within reach, and Bellwood would never be the same. The dawn of justice. The morning light streamed through the windows of Mary Anderson's home, casting a warm glow over the stacks of papers, laptops, and coffee mugs scattered across the living room. The night's tension had given way to a quiet resolve as Mary, Michael Harris, and their small team of volunteers prepared for the most critical day of their fight against corruption. A threat revealed. One evening, as Michael was reviewing documents in the dining room, his phone buzzed with a text from Lisa. "We need to talk. Found something big." Michael stepped outside to call her, pacing the porch as she explained. "Michael, we traced some of the financial transactions from the security firm. They're tied to a network of local officials, including the mayor. This isn't just about Daniels. It's a full-blown conspiracy." Michael's heart sank. "How high does this go?" "High enough that we need to be careful," Lisa replied. "If the mayor's involved, he'll have resources to push back, and Daniels will do whatever it takes to protect himself." Michael thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. He re-entered the house and shared the news with Mary, who listened intently. "This is bigger than we thought," Mary said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "But it doesn't change what we have to do. If anything, it makes it even more important." The confrontation. A week later, Michael and Mary's efforts came to a head. As they prepared to attend a town hall meeting, where the mayor was expected to address the growing scandal, Michael received an anonymous tip. "Watch your back tonight. They know you're coming." Despite the warning, Mary and Michael decided to proceed. The town hall was packed, tension thick in the air. The mayor took the stage, his polished demeanor masking the fear that lurked beneath. He spoke in vague terms about restoring trust and addressing concerns, but the crowd was having none of it. Michael stood, his voice cutting through the room. "Mayor, can you explain why funds from a private security firm tied to Officer Daniels have been traced back to your office?" The room fell silent, all eyes on the mayor. His composure faltered for a moment before he recovered. "I have no knowledge of such transactions," he said, his tone defensive. "If there are any irregularities, they will be investigated." Michael pressed on. "The people of Bellwood deserve answers, not empty promises. Will you commit to a full independent audit of your office's finances?" The crowd erupted into applause, and the mayor was visibly cornered. He mumbled a reluctant agreement before quickly leaving the stage. The victory. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded to include the mayor and several other officials. Daniels and his captain were formally charged with multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy. The private security firm was shut down, and its executives faced legal action. For Mary and Michael, the victory was bittersweet. The fight had taken its toll, but it had also brought the community together in a way that Bellwood had never seen before. People who once lived in fear now stood tall, knowing that they had the power to demand change. On a quiet evening, as Mary and Michael sat on the porch, watching the sun set over their town, Mary turned to her godson. "You did good, Michael," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Your parents would be proud of the man you've become." Michael smiled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We did this together, Aunt Mary. And we're not done yet. There's still more work to do." Mary nodded, her heart filled with hope. The dawn of justice had arrived in Bellwood, and she knew it was only the beginning of a brighter future.